l'histoire d'une société qui tombe et qui, au fur et à mesure de sa chute, se répète sans cesse pour se rassurer. Jusqu'ici, tout va bien. Jusqu'ici, tout va bien. Jusqu'ici, tout va bien. L'important, c'est pas la chute. C'est l'atterrissage.
On May 27, 1995, Matthew Kasowitz's La Haine premiered at the Cannes Film Festival, where it was met with wide critical acclaim, even earning Kasowitz the title of Best Director. There were many different things to praise about the film, but arguably the most noticeable was its social commentary. La Haine is a simple film. 3 guys in an area on the outskirts of Paris, and their entire day after their friend gets hospitalized, all told on a budget of less than $3 million. So how does Kasowitz use his time and money to create his message? Kasowitz began writing the film on April 6, 1993. The same day Makame Mbolo, a 17-year-old from Central Africa, was shot by a police officer in Paris. His death sparked riots in the area, which Kasowitz was present for. After going home, he started on the first words of what would become La Haine's script. As Kasowitz explained it, his script was meant to explore the question of what happened to that kid from the start of the day for it to end up like that. But the film's narrative runs much deeper than the span of a day. Prior to the events of the story, the trio's friend is hospitalized from the riots. The friend is inspired by another real-life victim of these protests, Malik Ousekine. Ousekine was a 22-year-old Algerian college student who was on campus near student riots. A group of policemen were breaking it up and, suspecting Ousekine to be a part of the chaos, chased him through a building and clubbed him. He died there in the hallway. These are just 2 of many popular cases that have gone through France and specifically Paris. The country has a negative history of police brutality, claims of discrimination against minorities by law enforcement, and problems related to the banlieues, or the French word for these neighborhoods around Paris that have historically been where working class populations live. Now let's take a look at the first shot of the film. It's the earth, in black and white. That's it for a couple of seconds, and then the fire from the Molotov helps transition into the car going up in flames, and the film erupts into videos of protests, with both police officers and civilians gathering in the streets. And although the montage uses real footage from 10 years of riots in Paris, it's still black and white. The lack of color removes any personal connection to the video, making the footage a blank slate. With this, the sequence's message is clear. The situation in France is not just in France. It's universal, and if it continues, the world will be engulfed in flames. Now, this sequence is very bold, but it matches the tone of the rest of the story well. It is constantly moving, high energy. Just look at how each of the characters are introduced.
Oh, Vince! Oh, il est bon ton shit, Vince.
C'est pas le mien, celui d'Hubert.
Doing shots like these has one main effect besides contributing to the style of the film. It launches you, as the audience, right into the action. The world building, particularly for this film, is essential to bringing its message alive. Kasowitz believed that La Haine needed to show the story from the kids' point of view because, quote, nobody knew the kids. And knowing the kids means knowing everything. Their insults, their banter, their music tastes. A scene may look like it's nothing, but that's because the film wants you to witness their lives, in all their actions and reactions. In that way, no scene is unimportant to the film. The characters are the message. Quite literally. In French media at this time, a phrase that often floated around was Black Blanc Bleu, which translates to Black White Arab. It was a play on the red, white, blue colors of the French flag, but it was mainly a derogatory term used to describe the people living in the banlieues. And the main characters of La Haine, Black Blanc Bleu. This is Kasowitz's way of fighting back against the media on behalf of the kids. The term created a stigma against these suburban populations and thus a divide between Paris and its outskirts. The film understands this and emphasizes how the kids feel out of place in this new setting in the second half. In the neighborhoods, the trio are shot on wide lenses, capturing both the characters and their background together. It's familiar, it's normal, But when we look at what it's like in Paris, everything is shot on a long lens, bringing that bubble in smaller to the characters. In the very first shot of the characters being in Paris, the camera utilizes a dolly zoom as the trio stand over the city. The dolly zoom, which originated in Hitchcock's Vertigo, is generally used to create a sense of unease in the characters and thus audience. Here, it does just that by making the background of all of the tall buildings come in closer to Hubert, Saeed, and Vince growing on top of them. We move away from the busyness of Paris back into this more comforting bubble with the characters who see the city as confusing and foreign. Now, the film does a great job at producing these underlying psychological effects. As we've established before, La Haine is fiery, quick, dynamic, and based in danger. We know that it's good at showing violence, but what it's better at is when it's not explicitly showing violence, when it instead plays with the possibility of it. In this scene, notice how the camera first starts, up close on Hubert and Vince's faces. As the camera swings around, it follows the movement of the police officers until eventually it focuses on them all, almost surrounding Hubert and Vince. The kids stand in the middle of the police station, staring at the policemen staring at them. It creates a suffocating feeling for them, a fear that they are going to be ambushed. But this feeling is mutual for the police officers because they watch Vince and Hubert, not knowing what they're going to do. It forms this barrier between the two sides where they are both watching each other, but neither of them are yet to fully do anything. Keep that in mind for later. Now, the film is filled with lots of these almosts. It's at every corner. The gun is a perfect symbol of this. Early on in the film, Vince reveals that he has stolen a gun from a police officer during the riots the night before. The action, done out of anger, provokes Vince to say he will kill a police officer if his friend dies. This places an immediate target on his back. He's done something unpredictable, and that is going to yield unpredictable effects. And there's that idea that at any given moment, the three characters could step into a trap. The second these numbers show up on screen, the ticking time bomb begins. In a scene where the three are being chased by the cops through a tunnel, Vince and Hubert encounter an officer who stares at them. Vince pulls out his gun and he is ready to shoot the guy. Pulling the trigger would change his life physically and mentally. The chain of events never happened because Hubert punches the guy to give him enough time to escape. Though the film and Vince's character may be viewed as a more power to you for the kids, that's not fully the case. Despite Vince being one of the main characters, he is not being perfectly defended. In fact, he is a part of that time bomb. There are two big qualities to note about Vince. First, he is white, so although he is discriminated against for being from the banlieues, he hasn't faced the same level of racism his friends have, specifically from the police. A Human Rights Watch report once noted that French police had overly broad powers to perform checks on specifically black and Arab men. Because of this, Vince's anger stems from seeing the treatment of his friends, and he creates his own hate. Yet, he is arguably the most vengeful and ready to take action out of the trio, with Saeed and Hubert never being any physical threats against the police. The second thing to note about his character is that he's never really the narrator. The film begins and ends on Saeed, and Hubert has his voiceover at those same moments, but Vince doesn't really have anything. And it's possible this is the film's way of saying what Vince does is not the solution. But despite this attitude, these moments, specifically with the gun, are still important to include. They allude to real-life events in Paris. When Makame was arrested for shoplifting, he was brought into an interrogation room. During the questioning, the police officer put a gun to Makame's head with the intention of intimidating him. The gun going off was what killed him. If this sight sounds familiar, it's because of this scene towards the end of La Haine. Hubert and Saeed are both tied to a chair, being held in an interrogation room. There are 3 police officers. One sits across from them and watches because he is an officer in training. The 3-minute scene shows the cops insulting the two and handling them roughly, demonstrating to the trainee how they would tackle the situation. They make sure to tell him,
Le plus dur, c'est d'éviter la bavure. C'est pas leur vie qui manque. On fait pas toujours ce qu'on veut.
Though he appears uncomfortable with these practices, he does not protest. All of this comes up to the film's identification of what the biggest cause for this problem in society is: education. Inside and outside of the film, the system for police officer training in France has been criticized for its lack of emphasis on human rights. The National Union of Uniformed Police Officers complained about how many officers were only taught to shoot at the torso and rewarded excellent marks if they hit one of the vital organs, instead of learning ways to defuse the situation without firearms. This alleged miseducation has led to many blunders, as it's often called, where citizens may die from a cop's firearm. According to an Amnesty International report, there were already 12 separate shootings around France in the 18 months leading up to Makame's death. and in most of the cases, the officers were not in clear danger and resorted to shooting as a first action. This is why Cassavetes lets the interrogation scene play out, to highlight flaws in the education of police officers that have played a role in these blunders. Though, as we've noted before, the film does not place this responsibility solely on the cops. Hubert is the character to represent this, when he says phrases like,
Ah putain, si t'étais allé à l'école, tu saurais. La haine attire. Attends, la haine attire, la haine.
in this situation, there is a cycle of hate. It begins with Abdel's death, which stemmed from hate. This leads to riots and more hate, and then more deaths and then more riots. This exact same thing happened after Makame's death. There were big riots in Paris, and some civilians were shot at these sites, which caused more outrage. And from this, others can be brought down to that level of hate. For example, there are a few good cops that the trio encounter in the film, but one of them is Samir, who helped bail Saeed out of jail early on. Cassavetes wanted to use Samir to show that not all cops fit into the generally negative role that is being given to them in La Haine. There are still good that exists. But interestingly enough, it is Samir who gets in the middle of a riot in the banlieues and gets shot by some of the people protesting. Remember that barrier between the officers and kids I mentioned earlier? When the two sides may stare or even yell at each other, as long as nothing happens, conflict arises whenever someone chooses to cross that barrier, whether that be an officer shooting at a kid or a kid shooting at an officer. There's a shot on the train that the three leads take to get to Paris. Hubert looks out the window and he notices a billboard. The world is yours. The shot is layered with audio from Vince as he talks about his excitement of knocking that police officer from the tunnel down and almost shooting him. It's ironic, like this is the world Vince wants to create. But something changes in Vince that following night. Despite all of his talks of being violent and volatile, he witnesses someone he knows go up to a bouncer and shoot him, point blank with a flare gun. Like that officer in the interrogation room, Vince watches in horror as if he can't handle the violence. The scene is edited to play out shortly after that interrogation moment, highlighting that connection. Shortly after this, he reunites with his other two friends and they pass the billboard again, but this time Saeed goes over and changes the wording on it to this. The change from yours to ours shows again that the problem has to be met from both sides, and that on the outside, they face similar challenges. In another one of the film's last scenes, Saeed and Hubert are attacked by a group of skinheads. Vince challenges them with a gun, holding it up to one of their heads and threatening to shoot. But after a minute of tension and deliberation, another one of those almost that the film loves to create, Vince backs away and lets him go. This moment represents growth in Vince's education. Even though he had spent the entirety of the film wanting to pull the trigger, he learns not to breed more hate. But as we reach the final scene of the film, none of this ends up mattering. As the three leave, they encounter one of those officers from the beginning rooftop scene, where the kids and the officers had argued but not been violent. The officer pulls out a gun, presses it to Vince's head, and Vince learning not to pull the trigger wasn't enough to save him, as the officer didn't learn either. And for the first time, the clock changes in front of the viewer's eyes, because Cassavetes wants to show that this is the present. This is the reality France is currently in the middle of. Now, the first and last shot of a film says a lot about its message. It can juxtapose images, highlight changes, and convey a message. When we go back to La Haine's first shot versus its last shot, they aren't visually similar at all. But over both shots is Hubert's voiceover. Exactly 3 times throughout the entire movie, he talks about a fall where everything seems okay at first. In the beginning, it's a man who falls, but in this last scene, Hubert changes the wording to society. And this switch means that a fall may begin with one man first, but this causes a domino effect, and eventually it's society as a whole crumbling. Both Hubert and the cop aim their gun at each other, and there is that balance again. They are both on the same level of hate. But now, the bar has lowered to where this invisible barrier is no longer just staring or yelling at each other. It's guns, destruction, death, much like what is shown in the film's first shot. We've fallen far to reach this point, and the kids have gone through tons of almosts to get here. But even though they escape death at those points, all it takes is one moment, which is why Hubert says,
Tout va bien. Jusqu'ici, tout va bien. L'important, c'est pas la chute. C'est l'atterrissage.
Cassavetes doesn't show who shot who, but much like his idea of putting the film in black and white, he wants to make the message universal. At this point, it doesn't matter who shot who. All that matters is that the shot happened. This sentiment has also been reflected in popular landmark films before. Spike Lee's Do the Right Thing tells a story of racial tensions in a Brooklyn neighborhood, which includes intervention from the police. The film is American, once again proving Cassavetes' point that these events are universal. In Do the Right Thing, there's many interpretations on if anyone does the right thing. And in a situation like this, what what is exactly the right thing? That's a question nobody can seem to answer in both films, and it leads us back to this stalemate.
You should be ahead of the problem, because you're saying if you don't look at the problem now, this is where it's going. That's what the movie is saying.
And who decides to pull the trigger is a part of the problem that remains relevant in today's society, inside and outside of France.
C'est l'atterrissage.